Honored to welcome you today to the launch of the report, Anchoring Accountability for Mass Atrocities, the permanent support needed to fulfill UN investigative mechanisms. This report has been prepared by Oxford University's Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict and the Blavatnik School, the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the International Bar Association. As many in this room have experienced, the most common refrain that we hear from survivors of mass atrocities is, "We want justice." Justice for them is defined broadly, from learning about where loved ones are to seeking criminal prosecutions. The voice in victims and survivors is clear. We're gathered here at a critical moment and a moment of opportunity, one where the hopes of these individuals and communities are high, as are the aspirations of the various UN investigations. A catch-all phrase that captures the broad spectrum of UN inquiry and investigative mandates tasked with the making findings of violations of international law that might amount to mass atrocities and contribute to accountability. As the report notes, since 2011, we've witnessed an accountability turn, whereby international justice requirements have been increasingly integrated into the mandates of UN investigations. And as of 2016, the creation of UN independent investigative mechanisms with the explicit mandate to carry out international criminal investigations and build cases to prosecute violations. These are explicit mandates to collect, preserve, and analyze evidence for the purpose of building cases for future prosecutions. Yet despite these developments, there have been challenges ensuring that these entities have received the corresponding resourcing and support that is needed to effectively fulfill their mandates and meet the rising expectations of both survivors and member states. This timely, in-depth study is intended to help bridge that divide, to help ensure that we're better equipped to meet the demands of survivors and support future prosecutions in addition to other forms of justice through better understanding the challenges arising for UN accountability mandates and how they can best be supported moving forward. It is now my honor to introduce the co-sponsor of today's event, Ambassador Kurt Jaeger, the permanent representative of Liechtenstein to the United Nations office in Geneva.
Thank you. Excellencies, colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and for those who are abroad, maybe good morning. I thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this public rollout of the Oxford Report on Anchoring Accountability for Mass Atrocities. The rule of law, ensuring accountability, and combating impunity remain high priorities on Liechtenstein's foreign policy. Upholding a high standard of respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law remains fundamental in respecting international obligations and demonstrating solidarity. In December 2016, some of you know, Liechtenstein had the honor to introduce a draft resolution that would later become UN General Assembly Resolution 71/248, creating the IIIM, also referred to as the Syria Mechanism, a common effort to ensure accountability for the most serious crimes under international law committed in the Syrian Arabic Republic since 2011. The mechanism's creation was driven in equal parts by the horror at the atrocities committed in Syria, our collective shame and frustration over the inaction by the Security Council, our firm belief that accountability was not only necessary but also possible, as well as our conviction that the UN General Assembly must play a central role when it comes to questions of accountability. We're very happy to see that the IIIM has firmly established itself as a successful model for accountability work and has been replicated by the creation of a nearly identical mechanism established by the Human Rights Council for the situation in Myanmar, the IIIM. Regarding the IIIM, we thank Catherine Markey-Uhel for able stewardship, which was crucial to that mechanism by the standing it now enjoys. Both mechanisms continue to demonstrate the value they add to justice efforts concerning the most serious crimes committed in Syria and Myanmar. Their success and political acceptance have further been expressed through the General Assembly's decision to secure their funding through the regular UN budget. Indeed, the mandate of the IIIM, the IIIM, and the manner in which they've been doing their work have been so persuasive that calls to establish a generic entity with an identical mandate are growing louder. And this is an idea worth discussing, and that's why we're here today. We're therefore very pleased to see these positive developments and thank the organizers again for moving the discussion forward on the establishment of a standing UN accountability mechanism. Through this necessary conversation, we can contribute to the creation of a system of justice mechanisms that is politically and financially sustainable. Moreover, we can help avoiding the proliferation of mandates within the UN system. For Liechtenstein, some of the parameters that need to be applied to such a standing mechanism are clear. Based on the success of the IIIM and the IIMM models, that is, a standing accountability mechanism would need to be an independent entity in the same manner as the IIIM and the IIMM. Also, the mandate should try to orient itself around the existing ones, as the IIIM mandate has proven to strike the right balance, I believe, between legal clarity and room for application. Moreover, an indispensable requirement for legitimacy is also the respect of the principle of non-selectivity. It is important that we use the debate to address remaining questions, of course. The question of what the trigger would be for adding situations to the work of such a standing mechanism is also of critical importance and probably the most challenging aspect of such a project, apart from the funding, of course. However, we should also give thoughts in the discussions to questions like how to integrate existing mechanisms or what size and financing of such a standing mechanism should look like. We believe it is important to be guided by what is needed and discuss pragmatic ways to achieve this. And I would like to thank the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, the International Commission of Jurists, as well as all other partners for organizing this event today, and look forward to a fruitful discussion, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jaeger. It's now my honor to introduce the other co-sponsor, Ambassador Katharina Stasch, the permanent representative of Germany to the United Nations in Geneva.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, dear colleagues. Thank you very much, Oxford Universities and all the other co-sponsors for the report and for the launching event today. I think this is very important also, not only to discuss among ourselves, but to make the project a bit more known. Now, it's a huge challenge, of course, to strengthen accountability and to fight against impunity. And having worked in the political sphere myself for the last years, I do know that we do need political will and political backing to address this challenge. And therefore, I'm glad to say that accountability and the fight against impunity has been and is and has been a priority for Germany for quite a while. Now, I think it's always very good to remind oneself why we are doing the things we are doing. So what is the rationale behind all of this? Impunity, let's face it, is mocking the victims. But it also has a broader dimension. Impunity is a threat to peace. We have learned, and as a German I know what I'm talking about, that justice is a precondition for reconciliation and stability and peace. So how can we strengthen accountability best? In my view, there are several pillars. First, at the international level, in international courts, as well as in the UN system. And of course, there's also our national courts. We can actually, which play a very important role. And of course, all of this is intertwined. And being a lawyer myself, I know that the basis of everything is we need the facts. We need sound methods to establish the facts. We need to collect proof, because without proof, there won't be the possibility to actually bring perpetrators to justice. And then there's an additional dimension to this. I think this becomes particularly clear in these times where disinformation is getting more and more a tool of also the political debate and political narratives. And this is that we do need mechanisms that do collect the facts, and we need that for our political debates as well. So there's two dimensions of it. It's the legal one, but also the more broader perspective of the political dimension. Now, much has been said already by my dear colleague, Ambassador Jäger, on the international dimension. Let me maybe only add one thing, and you touched upon it as well. We here in Geneva, we do create wonderful mandates in the Human Rights Council as a precondition and basis for accountability. But the best mandate is teethless when you don't have the financing. So that's why we as Germany also engage a lot in the financing. And for instance, we have pledged, I think, 1 million for accountability measures in OHCHR. So that's also one dimension one must never forget. Now, at the national level, you probably saw that German courts in the last years have engaged and that they have brought perpetrators to justice from Syria and including for crimes committed by Daesh against the Yazidi community. And I think this was a very important step also to show how national courts can contribute to the issue. Now, getting a bit more concretely, what do we need? What do we need to further strengthen accountability? First, we need to work together. Our focus should really be on connecting the investigative measures to international and national criminal justice systems. So we, as Germany, we encourage states to join us in these efforts. And we should also connect already existing accountability mechanisms. And I think a good example from the last days is how the monitoring mission, the existing monitoring mission for Ukraine, will work together with the newly established Commission of Inquiry for Ukraine. And I think it was last week when both leaders and experts of both missions, of both accountability missions, met here in Geneva, and they sat together many hours to actually discuss where do the mandates maybe overlap, but where's the extra value, how can they pass on facts which have already been established to the other mechanisms without doing double work, and doing that also with due respect to the victims. So these are very important questions, and I think for everything I saw, they are really doing well, and that is something we owe to the victims, but also, of course, to the good cause. Second, I think we need to profit from each other's experiences, and that's one of the reasons why Germany has committed in strengthening accountability in our G7 program. And that's why we actually want to work towards a standing mechanism. So we try to get the political backing for that in the now upcoming G7 deliberations. And you all know that we established a group of experts, and some of you, I think, are part of that, to come up with recommendations. And then there's the idea to present the outcome of that within the framework of the G7. So, therefore, I can say that we, and me particularly, we are very, today's event is a very valuable corner piece of the entire picture, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Stasch. It's now my honor to introduce Ambassador Beth Van Schok, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice.
Great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I want to congratulate the organizers, the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, the Program on International Peace and Security, the International Bar Association, and, of course, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for such a rich and interesting conversation. It's really been an honor to be a part of the conversation and the discussions over the last couple of days. It's also a great pleasure to be on the panel with my former boss, Ambassador Rapp, and predecessor, who is still an inspiration to, I think, so many, as he continues to just be at large, doing this work, advancing justice around the globe, with no mandate from any government or any institution, and yet there he is. As you know, and I think as this position attests, the United States has over the years supported a number of justice and accountability institutions, particularly when it comes to atrocity crimes, and it's very much part of our foreign policy that we recognize that impunity for such crimes is not only a problem from a deontological perspective, but also can lead to bad outcomes. We recognize that ensuring justice and accountability is not only a moral imperative, but it's also a question of national security and international peace and stability. Credible justice processes, as we know from empirical research, help to prevent the recurrence of abuse, help to address the needs and demands of victims for justice, and also just to strengthen the rule of law more generally. This, in turn, helps to mitigate the impulses of individuals to flee circumstances and cross international borders or to become internally displaced, and creates conditions for longer-term peace and security, and including prosperity around the region, as we've seen with respect to the war in Ukraine. Guided by these fundamental principles, the United States, with many of our allies and friends and partners, has been instrumental in standing up some of the key institutions that we think about. Of course, Nuremberg and Tokyo, but then also in the 1990s, the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, where I started my own career in this field back when I was a baby lawyer right after law school. And the international community has also supported new models of hybrid courts for Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, Cambodia, Lebanon, Bosnia, Kosovo. Some of these have had more success than others, but each one has generated lessons learned that I think will improve these institutions moving forward. We're also quite interested in helping with some of our partners in dealing with domestic efforts to address war or repression within their own systems in places like Colombia and Guatemala, which have fragile but still quite important transitional justice processes underway. And increasingly, we're working with foreign governments that are experimenting with domestic jurisdiction, like we've seen the incredible experience of Germany in using universal jurisdiction and other forms of extraterritorial jurisdiction to bring justice in their own courts under a robust set of incorporated criminal laws within their own penal codes. But as we know, notwithstanding all of these efforts and institutions and various levels at which cases can be brought, there are a number of situations where at this point in time there isn't an obvious pathway to justice. And as a result, accountability has proven to be elusive. And we know, of course, Russia's history of vetoing efforts to promote justice and accountability within the Security Council. So that body is foreclosed as a progenitor of justice institutions. But like so many people in this room, justice entrepreneurs have not been deterred, and as a result, they've been forced to think creatively about how to promote justice even when an obvious pathway through the Security Council has been blocked. And so as a result, we've seen, particularly here coming out of Geneva, really innovative mandates for commissions of inquiries, panels of experts, fact-finding missions, and now these new international investigative mechanisms that are investigating, documenting, verifying, preserving, analyzing information so that when there is a justice process anywhere, international, regional, domestic, extraterritorial, in the home state, if the politics allow, that information will be available. And as you said, you have to have the documentation to support justice. It's a condition precedent. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. And that's what these bodies are able to do. Many of these institutions have been able to build dossiers, and I think the IIIM is a great example of this, that can then be shared with prosecutors the world over to advance their cases. They're going to do their own investigations, but it's a jump start for that process. These mechanisms have also already demonstrated tremendous value in the promote of justice, as Naomi said, really broadly defined. So in some respects, they're a form of truth-telling. They're acknowledging abuses for the victims and the survivors. They've also provided really important information and evidence to a whole range of legal proceedings, including when it comes to cases before the International Court of Justice, adjudicating state responsibility, or even in our own system in the United States, civil suits under tort law seeking money damages on behalf of victims and survivors. In addition, we're also seeing this information undergirding sanctions regimes that are being picked up both unilaterally by states, but then multilaterally in different collections of states, the EU, through the Security Council, et cetera. Visa denials, and then, of course, diplomatic and public pressure to help prevent the recurrence of abuse. And as we know, these investigations, these analyses, this preservation of information is going to continue to pay dividends over time as justice pathways become available, because the information and evidence that they're preserving can be useful for many years to come. And of course, there's no statute of limitations for international crimes. At the same time, notwithstanding all of these contributions to justice, we see firsthand the challenges that these institutions face and that the system itself is facing. And these challenges are faced again and again. And I think the convening this week really brought to bear the recognition of the limitations of this system as it currently stands. As the Oxford report outlines, there are many gaps. There's competition for limited and specialized resources. There's a whole range of inefficiencies within the system. There's coordination problems when different institutions and organizations and entities are working on the same underlying situation country, and there are coordination and collective action challenges. And then also just navigating the modern information landscape, including the proliferation of digital information that's now being generated by modern conflict and situations of repression. We need new tools and techniques to deal with this overwhelming amount of information, and organizations like the IIIM are starting to develop that with technology specialists. There's also, I think, an acute need to identify and disseminate the best practices here and lessons learned from these previous efforts at justice and accountability, so that each new institution is stronger and better than the previous one. And then, of course, the coordination problem. But many of these challenges, I think, can be overcome, and convenings like this are one way to start thinking about doing that. In particular, I think many of the functions and needs of these institutions really lend themselves to centralization and benefit from economies of scale and the efficient deployment of technical expertise. So, for example, technology to enhance open source investigations, the need to authenticate, to deduplicate, to verify the digital artifacts that are being generated by conflicts the world over, including, I think, the sort of new horizon, which is the use of state-of-the-art machine learning to analyze huge amounts of information and to obviate the need for a human being to look at every single digital image that has been created or collected. Also, expertise that could be centralized would be mass grave, financial, and battlefield forensics. So how do we identify particular ballistics? What do we do with a mass grave in order to ensure the identity and return the remains with dignity to the families? Sexual violence, conflict-related sexual violence, and gender-based violence, and using trauma-informed techniques to conduct safe and sensitive interviewing and, more importantly, maybe screening of individuals, so that victims are not giving, as we've said, multiple statements to multiple interlocutors, having no idea what that information is being used for, who they're speaking to, what sort of informed consent. These are the kinds of best practices that could be centralized with a set of experts that could be then deployed to specific institutions. Secure data management, analysis, and preservation. It's not the most glamorous stuff, but this stuff needs to be preserved, and sometimes for many, many years to come. And so it needs to remain accessible as technologies change over the years. The ability to use military analysis to deconstruct a chain of command and then to construct the order of battle in a particular conflict zone. That takes very specialized knowledge, again, could be centralized. And then coordinating with civil society actors. We see a whole host of organizations that are very well-meaning from the civil society sector deploying themselves into the field. They want to be a part of the action, but are they working together in a way that's efficient? There are possibilities of having outreach and liaison officers through a centralized process that could help them identify where their best value add would be, where they could shine in terms of their own internal expertise to make sure the whole conflict is covered and not a lot of overinvestment and duplication. So we're really happy to be here today, and it's been very enlightening to participate in this event over the last couple of days to really start thinking forward-looking, not just to admire this exquisite set of problems that we've identified, but think forward-looking about ways to construct solutions to those problems. It's a really pressing issue, and there was a lot of foresight, I think, amongst the organizers to pull together this gathering and to invest so much time and effort in this project. The research, the report, the recommendations that will come, and the discussions are really, I think, laying a solid foundation foundation for us to work together to find a way forward to address some of these problems. And a way forward that acknowledges political, financial, logistical realities of the day, while at the same time honoring victims' needs for justice, their legitimate demands for justice, and our common interest in having a world in which justice and accountability is a fundamental part of our international relations going forward. So thanks so much for inviting me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you, ambassadors. As you rotate off, we'll bring in the panelists from the Oxford report. That was a master class in covering a lot of the key issues that are facing everyone on this particular panel. And in an attempt to summarize some of the key points, I think just all three of you expressed a common commitment to the priority of fighting impunity, that this is both a moral and political imperative. This is a national security priority for each of your governments, and that it's critically important that we take efforts right now to advance justice, but that requires both political will and financial sustainability, and that today is the moment for creativity to strengthen the investigative capacity of the various mechanisms and also help foster cooperation, including with national jurisdictions, to help bring forth future cases. And I think it was very important that Ambassador Stash mentioned the cases in Germany, where we have seen some of that cooperation with some of the individuals and the entities here. One way forward may be the creation of a standing entity, as Ambassador Yeager mentioned, and that would allow for the centralization of key shared functions. It would also hopefully help meet the challenges of the future, and those challenges, as Ambassador Van Schok just outlined, include increase in the amount of data evidence, the need for technology experts, the need for secure data preservation, machine learning, alongside also reforms, including in the basics of just hiring individuals with investigative skills and that are able to interview and inform in a trauma-informed manner, as we work to try to also coordinate with civil society. So perhaps this entity would be one way of meeting some of those challenges going forward and advancing the legitimate needs of victims. Right now, it is my honor as the Director of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to introduce our wonderful panelists and partners from Oxford who've undertaken this incredible research. I'd like to first introduce Federica D'Alessandro, the Deputy Director of the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, to share her reflections. I will note we have 9 remarkable panelists, so I'm going to put aside slightly Canadian nicety and really keep you to the 7-minute cap. So I might just flag at about 6 minutes so that each of you have enough time to share your reflections. Federica.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Naomi, for the introduction. I promise that I will behave, and I will maybe even keep it to less than 5 or 6 minutes. So first of all, I do want to thank you and the museum for your partnership. It's been invaluable to us. I want to, of course, thank our event co-sponsors. It's a true privilege to have Ambassador Stash, Yeager, and Van Schok here with us. And of course, I wanted to acknowledge also the presence of Ambassador Taylor. Clearly, we would love to be on the record in thanking the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for their enormous involvement and for their very constructive engagement with our process. Most of what we've been able to think through and a lot of the analysis that we've been able to carry out would have not truly been possible had it not been for just how constructive their engagement with our process has been. And of course, our gratitude also to the International Commission of Jurists for their partnership in this process and also for facilitating this room and this event in particular. I'd like to use my time to perhaps provide some framing remarks that will build on some of what has already been said, simply because, and maybe paint a picture of some of the general trends that we've identified in our research, simply because I think that these can help ground the recommendations that our report advances. We make 2 sets of recommendations. One set of recommendations insofar as what type of institutional reform or permanent support, so to say, is possible and is advisable from our perspective. And an additional set of recommendations that we advance deals with methodological, budgetary, and operational issues that we think are helpful for us as the international community to think through, irrespective of which direction of travel we decide to move forward with. When we think about the trends, the reason why we start with the question of whether some central capacity or central support is needed is because what our research has uncovered is that the accountability turn is, of course, one trend that we uncovered. But another trend that we have uncovered is the fact that when we talk about accountability, first and foremost, of course, as others have already said, we can't talk exclusively of criminal accountability. So we look at accountability really as a continuum, where different actors, different justice actors play a different role. At the same time, we do believe that for real justice to be delivered, it is important to serve the interest of each one of these justice constituencies. And because one of the trends that is emerging from our research is that the various justice constituencies do look at UN mandates, investigative mandates for guidance and collaboration, it made sense to us to start the conversation with, precisely what is reasonable to ask of mandates, and as we do that, what type of resources should we think about providing them so that they can perform their functions. And so, to us, the two main recommendations that we advanced, a recommendation for an investigation support mechanism and a recommendation for an investigation support division, they're intended in some ways to answer the call and perhaps address the needs of different parts or actors that perform functions at different places alongside this accountability continuum. So that is to say that although we are, of course, encouraged and keen for the accountability turn and for this trend towards criminal case building, and we do very strongly believe that there is a lot the UN entities and mandates can do in terms of concrete contributions to justice, and that we learn from the performance of the independent mechanisms for Syria, Myanmar, and ISIL-Daesh, it is also true that this trend is not substitutive and cannot be substitutive of the important role and function that human rights entities and bodies continue to perform. And we are very keen that that function and the role that these human rights entities support, fulfill. So these are the entities, mostly mandates that come out of the Human Rights Council and are supported by OHCHR, continue nevertheless to receive the support that is needed. And that is why we advance also a suggested part in investigation support division within the OHCHR alongside an investigation support mechanism that is independent and fulfill a role similar to what the mechanisms for Syria, Myanmar, and ISIL-Daesh perform. I guess that another trend that we've witnessed is, again, this growing symbiosis that is emerging from justice actors, and the fact that all UN mandates now sit at the life cycle of this information and evidence that eventually is intended to support justice processes across the board. And we see a lot of, I think, some of the trends that were identified by Ambassador Van Schaak, so lots of civil society groups are now not only carrying out documentation, there's a growing number, but also a growing number of professional organizations doing it professionally, collecting information and evidence of these crimes downstream from the mandates, UN investigative mandates, and then the expectation is that the mandates will process this information in some form, and then it will feed downstream to the justice authorities, whether internationally and domestically. So I suppose if that is I think that's the framing that I wanted to provide. The two takeaway, I guess, from my remarks are we have identified a gap, which is insofar as the criminal case building responsibilities are concerned, and making sure that there is, efficiencies moving forward. Thus, the need for an ISM, but also we are absolutely committed to acknowledging and supporting the work of human rights, the human rights piece of the work moving forward. And we absolutely invite states' leadership in ensuring that whatever solution we will have, it is not to the detriment of the latter. So I thank you for your time and for being with us.
Thank you so much, Federica, for that, and for putting up front one of the key questions that people often pose in regards to how this pertains to human rights monitoring and reporting and entities of such. So thank you for that and for framing the conversation. It's now my honor to introduce Ambassador Stephen Rapp, a visiting fellow of practice at the University of Oxford and also a fellow at the Simon Scott Center.
Well, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to focus for a moment on what motivates me and what motivates a lot of us to be involved in this process, to remain at large, as Beth indicated. And I used to always joke what I had in common with fugitives, which are also at large, is that I was, on the run because of the law. But it is a matter of seeing the law enforced, and frankly, the massive violations that we see across the planet, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide in some cases, the most serious and grave violations of human rights are rising. The High Commissioner on Refugees told us earlier this year we had 82.5 million people displaced from their homes internally, within their countries or across borders. That was before Ukraine. Now we can put that number probably internally and externally over 90 million. And those people aren't escaping just conflicts that are being fought between armies. They're escaping situations in which they are the primary victims. They are the soft targets that are being driven from their homes, from their schools, from their workplaces. And ending impunity for these crimes is certainly the passion of my life, involved at the Rwanda Tribunal and then as chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone that brought President Charles Taylor to justice. We really need to, for the most serious violations, create a true perception that if you commit these massive crimes, you will face accountability. And certainly since Syria, the absence of criminal justice until we've had these cases in Germany has sent a message that's, frankly cost us a coup in Sudan and in Myanmar and may have made people think they could get away with the crime of aggression and raining death out of the skies in Ukraine, not yet 3 months ago and since that date. And so where the world has turned in the last decade is to the Human Rights Council, to Geneva, to up to 20 mandates to find the facts, and almost always now to determine responsibilities, determine if these are crimes, to end impunity. And the question is whether there's the sufficient capacity and resources to do that. And obviously it's extremely important to have the fact-finding and the monitoring. But as we recognize, it was Liechtenstein's leadership, as Ambassador Yeager indicated, that taking it forward a step at the General Assembly at the end of 2016 and establishing a mechanism for Syria, even though while we continued the reporting of the Pinero Commission, was a critical step. And we've seen the same in Myanmar. We've seen the same now in also with ISIS-Daesh crimes in Iraq. And the question obviously that Ambassador Stosh is talking about is whether we need a standing investigative mechanism and what role it would play. And that's the issue that I want to focus on, and which our report, which is 110 pages long, we have a few hard copies to share, but it's available on the link that you can download with the announcement of this event, but basically presents two sort of structural steps, and the most important of which our group reached consensus on this morning, which is we need a standing mechanism. Now, we call that an investigative support mechanism. This is not the king of the world kind of operation, but that it would be an investigative support mechanism that would do two things. It could receive mandates like those of the Syria and the Myanmar mechanism that have given to them by a UN body, in order to do the work that Geneva Human Rights is not equipped to do, the kind of things that Beth talked about, the forensic analysis, the work in the digital sphere, the kind of work on linkage evidence and modes of responsibility that was so key to the successes that we had at international tribunals. And that's what, of course, Nick and Catherine are doing in their mechanism today. And then sharing that with justice actors like the Germans, like the Swedes, like others, and we hope, and indeed in the case of Myanmar, Argentina, in the case of Myanmar. So not just in the global north. And with other judicial bodies, and potentially as well with other processes that are non-judicial. It could also do a second thing, which is to provide support to other mandates that are issued here, mainly, or elsewhere, when those mandates are dealing with broader issues of human rights, but they need help with these sorts of tools. That is our essential point here. But we also, in the course of all of this report, if you read it, recognize that we have to recognize that there is an ecosystem in human rights and in criminal justice and in an accountability that's been building, and we've certainly seen it since Syria. And we have to recognize that those of us that are associated with governments or with international or intergovernmental organizations are not necessarily the engine of this particular machine. It's civil society groups that are increasingly empowered, that are developing the skills to collect the evidence, that have access to the ground in places the UN or that state authorities can't go. Essential when we deal with the Caesar photos, with the linkage evidence, the 1.3 million documents that CIJA has brought out with the Syrian assistance from that country, the kind of evidence that we have gathered in open sources by Bellingcat and others that provides us this definitive information linking perpetrators to crimes, that these works are there and that the UN needs to be seen as really a second stop in that ecosystem, which gathers that information, recognizes that it may be biased, works to verify it, collate it, analyze it, and make appropriate use of it, really downstream, reporting processes, but also in criminal justice processes. And so our report at Oxford was based upon dealing with the actors in that ecosystem. And we dealt with 160 individuals involved in those evidence-producing organizations, which include lots of NGOs, some traditional, some like the Truth Hounds of Ukraine that we heard from yesterday, that are really at the grassroots, or they may be IGOs like the International Commission on Missing Persons, the people that are working at that end. Then dealing with people that have worked within these UN processes, who, for instance, told us that they only think 10% of the right people are being recruited many times. That was what the people said that were in the system. We think that's improved. But we got a lot of very, very frank answers about deficiencies in the process that we want to see improved. And then we deal with the consumers, the German prosecutor, the Swedish prosecutor, the prosecutor of the ICC, and what they need to win their cases, to hold people to account, and to truly create the perception that if you commit these mass atrocities, that there's going to be consequences. That's what this is all about. And I think we're at an opportune moment with the horrors of the Ukraine, with the pressure constantly to move forward after we have commissions of inquiry and have another mechanism and another mechanism and another mechanism to finally move forward in this process. But it can't be just an effort from the G7, and we so much salute Germany for taking the lead in this area and for the G7 to take a lead, but we want to engage globally because this has to overcome selectivity. It has to make sure that it's available whenever these crimes are committed in the world, and that we've got appropriate triggers to make sure that these are not irresponsible mandates, that they really are put into effect when there are very serious crimes and very serious needs, but that it will serve the interests of victims globally to protect them from mass atrocities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Rapp. I think everyone can see why it's so critical that he remains an ambassador at large, with your very passionate articulation of the why and the consequence of the absence of justice, notably with the Burma coup, Ukraine aggression that we're seeing right now, but also just what the standing mechanism would seek to do, and very much appreciate the focus that you put on articulating the ecosystem that's developed. It's staggering to think the 1.3 million sources that CIJA has collected in Syria alone, and how many organizations are out there doing the same type of work, and the importance of having these investigative mechanisms to collate, verify, and make use of it. It's now my honor to turn to Sarita Ashraf, who's a visiting fellow of practice at the University of Oxford and also affiliated with the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide.
Thank you, Naomi. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been great to have the discussions with you all over the past few days, both those of you who are in the room and those joining us virtually. I want to speak a little bit about the continuing important role of commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions and other entities that go by various other names, such as the Group of Eminent Experts and the Commissions on Human Rights. These entities, which I'll refer to more globally as commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions, remain the backbone of UN-mandated investigations in situations where mass human rights abuses and violations of international law have occurred or are still occurring. At the outset, as you've heard, we take a broad definition of accountability, recognizing that the mandates of COIs and FMMs has expanded to include an expectation and responsibility for individual criminal responsibility to be tackled as the entities do their work. However, COIs and FM, Commission of Inquiries, fact-finding missions, have always had a role in accountability processes. They lay the ground for work on state responsibility. They also produce incontrovertible historical narrative, which comes into truth-seeking, if not better described as truth-telling. OHCHR, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, plays a defining role in the setting up and the supporting of the running of these bodies. When the mandate of the COIs and FMs closes, when their mandates end, OHCHR supports the process of closing down and then stands as the guardian of the information and evidence collected, liaising then with later prosecutions or later calls for that evidence or information to be shared. So we do underline in the report and in our research not only the importance of the human rights reporting functions of COIs and FFMs, their integral function within the ecosystem that has been described by Ambassador Rapp, but also their importance in the supporting the health of the COIs and FFMs and the need to include that. Since 2010, we have seen that mandates have expanded to include more clearly the expectation and responsibility to identify alleged perpetrators and to cooperate with judicial and other relevant authorities. This has been seen very clearly in many of the mandates, but if you look at the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry in Ukraine, which is one of the more recent mandates, you can see quite the level of expectation, the level of responsibilities that are being placed on the shoulders of the Commission of Inquiry, and they're implicitly on the shoulders of the sections of OHCHR, which are tasked with the setting up and supporting the running of the Commission of Inquiries. However, what we have noted is that the resources have not increased in line with the level of expectations and responsibilities that have been placed on these entities. For that reason, one of the core recommendations, one of the two core recommendations, concerns the establishment of an investigative support division within OHCHR that would assist in the prompt recruitment and deployment of effective and well-resourced teams, as is required, but would also help as a repository of institutional memory and by standardizing the preparatory process and other drafting of SOPs and investigative plans. There's a huge economy of scale when it comes to commissions of inquiry. A lot of the needs that they start off with following the interpretation of the mandate are common across commissions of inquiry. And there's also a great need to standardize some of the more basic working processes. So part of that is simply that it creates a clearer best practice, but for mandates which are shorter, which are shorter, which are perhaps only 1 or 2 years, which is a lower guarantee of renewals, is particularly important for efficiency, that once they start to run, that they run very quickly, particularly given they are not only doing an investigation akin to an international criminal investigation, looking at individual alleged perpetrators, but are also doing a broader pattern of human rights, reporting on human rights violations in a broader pattern, and often have to report sometimes within a 6-month time period. We heard from one of the commissioners in the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine yesterday speaking about their plans where they have to report, I think, maybe in the July or September session, and are still trying to recruit permanent staff onto their team. So the challenges are immense. Investigative Support Division is particularly, we think, a particularly important step to take in supporting the CUI's FMFMs, but also supporting OHHR as it continues to do the important work of the foundational work of these bodies. It's also very important because as the COIs and FFMs establish themselves, form, and then as their mandate comes to an end, the institutional knowledge that an ISD, what we've referred to as an ICU, Investigative Support Division, has, is that it allows for a continuing repository of knowledge, but also continuing relationships with now international prosecutors, but what is actually now national prosecutors from all over the world, who will continue to seek out information as they identify potential accused on their territory or within that their jurisdictions become seized as. So it's something that we will continue. I think I'm going to hand over to Chris to speak a little bit about the mechanism. But one of the things that we do want to underline is that these are not necessarily alternatives, that they each have a very important role. And it is abundantly clear that the crucial role of COIs and FFMs and the need for OHHR to be able to support them and to have the resources and backing to support them properly and sufficiently is something that will continue on and should continue on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarita, for articulating that particular case, and it's one of the 2 options that's outlined in the report, and underscoring again, these are not mutually exclusive in terms of supporting both endeavors. It's now my honor to turn it over to Kirsty Sutherland, a visiting fellow of practice at the University of Oxford.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again. I will try not to repeat what Sarita has so elegantly articulated, but of course there are great similarities, or some similarities, between the 2 recommended models. As has been described, the appetite for accountability has expanded, and in so doing, it's drawing in new actors, and there is an increased focus, from what we can see in from our research, in criminal accountability. And with that, we've seen the forging, I think, of new alliances between civil society organizations and more traditional prosecuting authorities, and some symbiosis or increasing symbiosis between their goals and their methods of interacting. So fighting impunity, as we've heard, obviously the primary focus has got to be the victims and the witnesses. And in line with this, those gathering information on the ground, those that Ambassador Rapp has interviewed at length, have strongly prioritized criminal accountability and not only want to see their material used in accountability processes, but also want to ensure that their practices and their relationships meet the necessary forensic standards and enable that material to reach the courtroom. And of course, as was articulated by our eminent ambassadors earlier, accountability is meaningless, criminal accountability is meaningless unless it meets the courtroom and meets forensic standards for successful prosecutions. And in line with that, of course, national prosecuting authorities interviewed by Ambassador Rapp increasingly are pursuing cases now in domestic jurisdictions, as we've heard, and relating to situations where, of course, they may not be able to go. And they're increasingly, therefore, reliant, as we've detailed in the report, on the investigating personnel on the ground, exercising great risk to gather material to inform us all what's going on. They're also increasingly reliant on information gathered by investigative bodies at the UN level, commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions. They described historic frustrations with some of the rules that mean that information can't be shared with them, with anonymous sources, difficulties with collection standards, and of course with multiple actors entering arenas at the same time and often repeatedly questioning vulnerable people. Many of those frustrations, however, have turned into enthusiasm with the advent of the newer specialized criminal investigative mechanisms. Prosecuting authorities, of course, I know that I may be teaching grandmothers to suck eggs because of the expertise in this room right now, but prosecuting authorities need material that holds optimal evidentiary weight or integrity. They need contextual analyses, and increasingly they need linkage evidence, and the UN bodies are all extremely well placed to provide this material. They need international assistance for access to evidence, for international or intergovernmental coordination for sharing information and for avoiding the duplication of evidence and of efforts. Again, UN bodies stand very well placed to provide that service. Primarily, they need access to forensic expertise, data analysis, and they need to be able to trust investigative bodies. Our report covers the nuts and bolts of how we recommend that the necessary support is given to these bodies, and I encourage you then to read that, but I won't labour the point. But in considering the model of an investigative standing mechanism, support mechanism, I apologise, we're really recommending ways in which to strengthen the necessary expert support to enable proper prosecutions. I'm under time pressure, sorry. And by centralising that expert support, we develop the provision of in-house experts in international criminal law and the investigation of particularly difficult crimes such as sexual violence and crimes against children. We believe that model would provide in-house specialism in digital evidence, open source investigation and verification, data security, and the necessary archiving expertise that would ensure that material is available in the long term and can be interrogated for the purposes of structural investigations. So such a body would exist to strengthen accountability through commissions of inquiry, fact-finding missions, and in courtrooms around the world. The IIIM has shown that the means and importance of working with evidence-providing organisations means that both bodies are empowered. The evidence-providing organisations and the IIIM seems to be strengthened and empowered by their learning together. And words that I think we've heard a lot over the last few days and in our research were trust and cooperation. And it seems to us that the model of a permanent support mechanism would go very far to enabling the development of both of those things between prosecuting authorities, those on the ground, and the UN. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Kirsty, to underscore what the proposal is and also where the needs lie, especially when it comes to the importance of building trust and how this entity could help do that, and also address specific expertise that's needed. Notably, you mentioned sexual violence, issues pertaining to children and others, so very much appreciate your articulation there. We're very fortunate now to have a number of individuals who are responsible for leading investigative mechanisms, which is a challenging task. So we're looking forward to hearing from them about the challenges they face, how best they can be supported, and also to respond to the options that have been put onto the table. So to start with, I'd like to turn to Nicholas Kumjan, the head of the IIN for Myanmar.
Thank you very much. Well, having, like Michelle, been at the beginning of the building up of a mechanism, I can say that it is extremely difficult to build from the ground up. It's very complicated to get the persons with the expertise that's needed following all of the requirements of the UN recruitment system, and it took quite a bit of time to build the mechanism. I also found that, as the mechanism was built and as our efforts evolved, my thinking about what we needed in our mechanism evolved. We saw that, for example, I definitely underestimated the need for people with Burmese language, because we have many more materials in that language than I ever anticipated we possibly would be able to get. So this is the kind of thing that having expertise available to start up a mechanism, I think would be very, very useful. But I would also say that there's a lot of dangers that I want to avoid, and that would be that you end up with an entity that would be watered down and not be effective. It would simply be a moderately effective passive collector of evidence. Well, I think what you really need, what we hope to build with mechanisms, is not to be only passive, but to be targeted collections of evidence. And I think that's what we're doing in the Myanmar mechanism. Also, the challenges that each of the mechanisms face are going to be quite different. Some entities, for example, UNITAD, operate inside the country and have cooperation of the government. Our mechanism, we have no access to Myanmar at all. The clients or the customers for our information, for the information of different mechanisms, is going to differ and have different requirements of what they want. So for example, the International Court of Justice has very flexible rules on what kind of evidence would be considered, while the International Criminal Court, or especially national courts, may have very strict rules on what they would admit into evidence in their proceedings. So what we could do to help them would differ from situation to situation. So I think it's very important that if an entity is built to help coordinate all these efforts, the important effort to reach accountability for crimes, as Ambassador Rapp so articulately expressed, it's important that it really still be given the power to make very effective collections of evidence that would be able to prove the responsibility of individuals, which is always extremely challenging in mass crimes and war crimes and crimes against humanity. The other thing that I think is very useful that is needed is, I think when the mechanisms have been created, there hasn't been a lot of direction. I don't know if there was a lot of thought of what happens when the mechanisms end, or what is the legacy, what happens to the information, as Ambassador Rapp also pointed out. A woman gives a statement and talks about being the victim of sexual violence. 20 years go by. Does that mean that she no longer has a problem with that being public? It probably still has. Her children may not even know about it. But if a state has the perpetrator of crimes in custody, or has that ability to arrest them and ask for information, who is going to be available to actually search through millions and millions of pages of evidence collected by a mechanism to determine, is there evidence against that person that can be shared? How then can you determine, do you have consent to share that information? For example, from this woman or from an NGO that gave the information 20 years ago. So these are a lot of the challenges that I think some kind of entity that would be responsible for receiving the evidence of mechanisms after their main activities are finished would be very, very useful to have. So I think in brief, those are my comments. I could pass to others.
Brief but incredibly powerful and impactful in terms of just the expertise gap at the startup, but also this really profound question around the legacy and what do we do, what have we committed to do. I'd like to now introduce Michelle Jarvis, the Deputy Head of the IIIM for Syria.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Naomi. Well, I have been thinking hard about how to make the best use of the 7 minutes that I've been allocated this afternoon, and what are the most important insights to try and convey from the experience we've had at the IIIM over the last 5 years in trying to build a mechanism from the ground up. But actually, I think overall the case for structural reform in the accountability landscape is already quite clear. And I think our colleagues from the Oxford project have really done an excellent job of setting it out in their report. Accountability would be better served if each new mandate didn't have to start from scratch in setting up the infrastructure required for their work or developing time-consuming policies and processes. Accountability would be better served if the skilled multidisciplinary teams we need to do our complex work could be assembled much faster. And accountability would be better served if we could ensure that the lessons learned and methodological advances could be continuously channelled back into each new mandate. We also know, as Nick said, we need better ways of ending mandates, handling residual issues and ensuring proper archiving. So today what I do want to do is just focus on 3 key trends that we see in the accountability landscape that should inform how we think about structural reform moving forward. The first trend is the growing recognition of the need for coordinated and integrated action by the many different actors forming part of the accountability ecosystem. The development of an interconnected framework is a big conceptual change for accountability. Historically, individual components have really been viewed in isolation from each other, and I think particularly international actors have been viewed in isolation from all of the rest. But the IIIM definitely sees itself as one part of the emerging accountability ecosystem for Syria. And this ecosystem, of course, includes victims and survivors, Syrian and other civil society documenters, human rights fact-finding actors like the Commission of Inquiry for Syria, and national war crimes units exercising universal jurisdiction. And now we have the prospect of adding the International Court of Justice as a result of the proceedings instituted by the Netherlands and Canada against Syria for breaches of the Convention Against Torture. But of course, the risk stemming from the proliferation of actors in the accountability ecosystem is fragmentation and duplication rather than what we want, coordination and economies of scale. So we see the IIIM's justice facilitation role as an important method to avoid this fragmentation trap. As you know, the IIIM doesn't prosecute or adjudicate cases, but instead supports other actors who do this work. While its specific contours will vary depending on the situation in question, we increasingly see the ecosystem model as the future of international justice. And we can also clearly see the justice facilitation role is not ad hoc. It's not an ad hoc need requiring short-term structures, but really something for which there is a broader need, and where we would benefit from having endurable but flexible structures within which to embed a standing justice facilitation capacity. The second trend I want to address is innovation in information management, and related to this, the establishment of integrated multidisciplinary processes to support accountability work. When we started our work at the IIIM, I think we were very conscious of the massive information management challenge that we would face. The proliferation of digital documentation about the Syrian conflict was part of the challenge. So was the multiplicity of information providers, all working with different methodologies, formats and languages. Then the endless amount of information on the internet, which is complex to preserve, process and analyse. The IIIM had to reimagine standards and practices from other courts and tribunals to build teams and processes oriented around more modern information flows. It was not long before we began to receive a steady stream, now I would say a flood, of requests for help from other actors, all facing similar challenges. To date, we've assisted more than 30 organisations, including more than 10 UN accountability bodies. Each new accountability-related mandate generates hours of consultation with IIIM staff members. There's clearly a need for a centralised standing capacity to support digital and other information management associated with accountability work. But this is much more than a tech issue, of course. Modern technology is important, but it's not a magic solution for accountability work. More fundamentally, we've been focusing on integrating technology into effective information management processes and then fluidly integrating this into entire IIIM workflows. Another important element of the integrated process challenge has been ensuring the integration of gender and child-sensitive analyses as a core part of our work to facilitate inclusive justice for Syria. Past experience has shown the risk of silos from approaches that rely on isolated focal points or specialised teams if they're disconnected from the core workflows. Here too, we've done extensive reimagining of previous approaches and are testing new internal architecture, strategies and tools with very promising results. But integrated processes take time, resources and specialised expertise to establish. We need to continuously test and adjust our approaches in light of emerging insights. Ad hocness is the enemy of this objective. We need enduring but flexible structures within which to embed integrated process blueprints and a cadre of experienced and expert personnel to transfer across mandates. And then the third trend, which I'll mention very briefly, is the growing commitment to a victim and survivor-centred approach in accountability work. Here also, I think we've seen a really important evolution. For the IIIM, this means crafting our justice facilitation role based on the views and interests of victims and survivors. Over the 20 years that I've been practising international criminal law, covering former Yugoslavia, Rwanda and now Syria, there are some recurrent insights about our engagement with victims and survivors that provide compelling incentives to reform. To highlight just a few, we need strategies for staying in touch with victims and survivors who've given statements to ensure appropriate follow-up over time. We must strive to minimise the number of times victims are asked to recount the trauma that they've experienced, to develop a system where a single statement can be accessed by all relevant actors. And we must find a way to centralise information and ensure quality control when it comes to humanitarian service referral pathways for victims and survivors engaging with accountability actors. So if we're genuine about a victim and survivor-centred approach for accountability, we need enduring but flexible structures within which to embed solutions to these recurrent obstacles. I've been very optimistic so far about the benefits of structural reform, and we are optimistic. But before I close, maybe to just link in with what Nick was saying, I do want to add a note of caution. Whatever we do, we have to be careful not to dilute resources that are available or to lose the ability to specialise on a specific conflict situation, which I think is really one of the key strengths of the existing mechanisms. In sum, we have no shortage of ideas about structural reforms that would help strengthen accountability work. But as English mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead put it, ideas won't keep. Something must be done about them.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that articulation of the three core areas where you feel that there is need for reform, and really just for, in your conclusion, underscoring the importance of having a victim-centered approach and the need for flexibility to allow for that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Miriam Philo, the Senior Political Advisor and Head of Office for UNITAD.
Thank you, Naomi. Excellencies, dear colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting UNITAD to join this highly important discussion. Christian Richer, the Special Advisor and Head of UNITAD, sends his best regard. He is currently traveling in northern Iraq, and he could not be with us today. So as you know, UNITAD, or the investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh, ISIL, was created by the Security Council in 2017. We are mandated to support domestic efforts to hold ISIL accountable by collecting, preserving, and storing evidence of acts that may amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide committed in Iraq. And UNITAD works closely with the Iraqi authorities in accordance with existing UN procedures and protocols, and supports third states jurisdiction, addressing actually exponential requests for information or assistance to our team. And in other words, UNITAD is currently one of the pieces of this international criminal justice ecosystem that we're mentioning since 2 days. And at this stage, we wish to warmly congratulate the authors of the report for their impressive work. And even if so far UNITAD takes no formal position on the recommendations per se, on either option 1 or option 2, or even a combination of the two options, basically. As it goes beyond the mandate of UNITAD, we stand ready to share lessons learned and to assist other UN accountability mandates holders, as well as your team, to go on with an even more practical discussion on the further steps to be implemented from now on. And we think that the question you raised is pivotal, decisive for the future of accountability and the fight against impunity of massive atrocities, basically. We are also convinced that this is the right moment to have this debate all together. The right moment, it must also be the story of having the right person to discuss this issue. But the right moment, and as discussed this morning, the journey has started, and UNITAD is extremely keen in remaining part of this journey towards uncovering accountability for mass atrocities. And as a prosecutor myself, currently proudly serving with UNITAD, having both perspectives in mind, basically, the role of a prosecutor, meaning a potential recipient, potential client of information and evidence gathered and stored by a UN accountability mechanism, but also the perspective of UNITAD, that is to say, the one of a current existing UN accountability mechanism. I would like to highlight 3 main points. And actually, we mentioned this morning that we need to be bold. 3 main qualities that I and our team would like to think as crucial when discussing about the permanent support needed to fulfill UN investigative mechanisms. First of this, sustainability. Sustainability of investigative strategies related to core international crimes. Investigations and processing evidence requires time and sustainable funding for longer-term planning. Conducting a comprehensive analysis of such a huge amount of information, as well as grounding, establishing charges against a person of interest or potential suspect, takes time, the specific time of justice, and even a longer time, a too long time for the victims. Thus, sustainability of budget for accountability mechanisms is highly necessary. States or donors should consider increased regular budget funding and supplemented by voluntary contributions, basically. Sustainability of working conditions as well. This is also key to be able to attract and hire staff with the right skill and set of expertise, be it from forensic, legal, law enforcement, judges, and prosecutors. And finally, on that point, sustainability as regard to mandates, obviously. It could also be mandates like open-ended one, or at least be the subject of a renewal after more than 2 years, but at least 2 years. Second point, or second quality that UNITAD would like to mention, preserving an effective and situation-specific approach as much as possible. Indeed, circumstances leading to core international crimes, as well as possible responses of international community to a given situation, differ greatly. And it is essential to preserve the range of maneuver of each existing and future accountability actor. A new additional body may assist in the setup and in the eventual closing of a country-specific accountability actor, but should not be considered as the sole backdoor channel. And for instance, every day UNITAD has this specificity, this benefit from its geographical positioning, being in Iraq, basically. Third point, last but not least, a quality that we would like to praise as well, keeping in mind the necessary comprehensive justice approach. UN accountability actors are support entities, and they do not have any prosecutorial powers themselves. Therefore, it is important to work with the jurisdiction of states towards ensuring accountability for core international crimes and to engage in dialogues to this end. This includes, when it's possible, of course, the domestic jurisdiction of the states directly affected by the crimes, when it's possible, as well as those actively prosecuting and adjudicating these cases based on the clause of universal jurisdiction. Hence, it is vital to us to continue raising awareness and building political support for a comprehensive justice approach and to include into our discussion national prosecution offices within our debate from now on and until the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I'm struck by how all three of you have highlighted points that the Oxford team captured. Clearly, there is a commonality in the challenges that you're facing, but also in many of the solutions that you see for the way forward, which I think presents, again, this moment of opportunity right now, hopefully to be seized on. We're going to turn right now to the perspective from OHCHR. Many of the recommendations speak to the capacity that you have, so I'm very curious your perspective. Paul Ortley from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Naomi. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today, and I just want to acknowledge my colleagues Francesca Marotta, Roberto Ricci, who have been with the discussion process over the last few days and with you as the report has evolved, so acknowledgement to them too. It's such a timely study from our point of view. I had a quick check before coming up here, and we have 10 Human Rights Council mandated investigative processes that are now currently underway, right now, 10. When I joined the UN, one of those per year was an earth-shattering occasion, so that degree of shift in such a short time really makes clear how much flux there is in this whole area, the rapidity of the evolution, and also the degree to which the Human Rights Council has become a creative actor in response to the political blockages in New York. I know from your colleagues that's not always well seen, but it's a political reality that has very explicit implications for our office and for the wider ecosystem that we're discussing. So it's been pointed out that the trend towards increasing emphasis in the Human Rights Council mandates towards accountability is clear, but what that means for our office is, of course, at the center of that is individual criminal responsibility where it can be made out. That can sometimes be made out with more work, with better methodology, but there are other times where it can't be made out, and we can't neglect the other aspects of accountability that are there too. State responsibility, it's been mentioned, institutional accountability, different types of truth-telling, processes of fact-finding, historical record, victims' ability to present their views. All of that to us is part of this broader concept of accountability that I know is an important aspect of the report, but for us that's fundamental. And we do, in that respect, value very much your recognition as well in the report that the fact-finding that's been currently undertaken by Human Rights Council mandates serves important further functions beyond this issue of supporting individual criminal responsibility being established. And you've talked about public-facing functions such as advocacy, monitoring, and reporting. Those are fundamental for OHCHR. So whatever changes we move towards in the future, and we accept that there's a need to really think thoroughly about what those are, we can't have those at the cost of any of those other functions. These are complementary and mutually reinforcing. So we'd want to avoid any situation where there was an overemphasis on the specific aspect of individual criminal responsibility on the part of the Human Rights Council mandates generally. And just to add to that although this study focuses on increasing support to accountability at large, as I mentioned, those future structures really do need to be conceived taking into account the best way that the system as a whole can deliver on those functions, which, as Nick and Michelle pointed out, might vary quite considerably according to different situations, and the flexibility to adapt structures to individual situational contexts has to be preserved in some form or other, however that might be, could take different forms. From our point of view, absolutely, the new wave of mechanisms, Syria, Myanmar, have proven their worth. OHCHR and OLA were there at the birth, acknowledging Cécile Abtel in the room here for the work that she did in taking that first mandate with Syria together with colleagues in New York and making that mean something in the practical terms of reference. Again, with respect to Myanmar, OLA and ourselves, we worked together very closely to establish the terms of reference that the SG promulgated there and quite extraordinarily promulgated to the GA and to the Human Rights Council as a formal document. That had never happened before and was a really powerful statement from from headquarters as to the system's political commitment to these kinds of mechanisms too. In terms of the human rights fact-finding mandates that we support, there are 2 points that I wanted to make for the room here. There's barely a situation in any of the mandates that are currently ongoing where we don't have requests at international and national level coming in from international and national prosecutors and investigative judges in civil law jurisdictions and even in common law contexts for information that we have. And in that, I'm talking both about OETHR's own collection of information as well as material that's come from independent mandates that have concluded and whose archives fall to OETHR. Those are not in New York. Those are here in Geneva with OETHR. And the High Commissioner is the guardian of those archives. This is work that's under the public radar. We don't report on it in much the same way that the mechanisms don't discuss in any detail the specifics of communication with different national authorities. But it's important for colleagues to be aware that that work is real and it's happening and it's substantial. That's not to say that processes can't be improved, that we can't standardize methodologies further, that we can't devote more resources to that to accelerate the work, but it's there. It's not something that many people are aware of, but that's one of my core functions at OETHR every day is responding to these national authorities, whether they come to us directly or often that comes through New York through the Office of Legal Affairs, with whom we work closely in responding to the different jurisdiction. And these aren't just jurisdictions confined to Europe. We really are talking about all regions of the world reaching out to us more typically on situations that concern their regions in the world, but also sometimes on other ones. Argentina and Myanmar is a good one, where there is global interest in the available relevant information that addresses these kinds of situations, wherever it is. I don't want to discount the frustration sometimes that some national prosecutors and judges, I mean, you probably hear more about those than the ones that are very happy with what they've received for obvious reasons. But there is sometimes disappointment on the part of international and national prosecutors and judges as to what the UN is able to provide. There's some degree of inevitability around that. Yeah, thanks very much. Given the bedrock commitment that we give victims and information providers, that their information stays with us unless there is express specific consent by that information provider to pass it on. Often we go back where that consent is not clear on key information to try and get it. That's not always possible. And some of the ideas that have been advanced about better maintaining the ability to access victims and witnesses that have been engaged with in the past is a key point. That's one area where we've been absolutely strengthening our methodological support, both within OETHR and the support that we provide to external mechanisms for more consistency, for higher standards, and for better efficiency. Can we do more? Should we do more? Yes, we are doing more. That's a reality too. On the operational side, we've also invested a great deal in strengthening the operational support, both in the startup phases of new mandates, as well as in the ongoing lifetime tenure of mandates and our ability as OHCHR to provide that. And there's a lot of work that's going into that area, both on the methodological side and the operational side. And I do want to acknowledge the generous contributions of Germany and of the Netherlands and other contributors that have enabled us, in the absence of regular budget decisions, to advance that work. Of course, we would like to go further, and as resources match that, we certainly will. I'll leave it there, given the time that we're at, but very much looking forward to the discussion, and thanks so much for having us here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Paul, and especially for highlighting just the challenges around provision of information to whom. What does that mean in terms of engaging with domestic jurisdictions and national authorities, but also just really starkly outlining the importance of complementarity. We've seen with the Syria COI and also the IIIM, the importance of having these parallel structures, each serving different roles. Now, finally, it's my pleasure to introduce the Secretary General of the International Commission of Jurists, Sam Zarifi, who's been actively involved in these conversations about the importance of a standing entity. And it's also, I just have to say, I was remiss in not mentioning earlier the important role that ICJ played in co-sponsoring this event as well. So thank you very much, Sam.
Thanks very much, Naomi. Your Excellencies, I am Sam Zarifi, Secretary General of the International Commission of Jurists, and also keenly aware the last of 13 speakers, which I attribute mostly to the alphabetical order, but I see that that is not entirely correct. I hope it is not attributable to also the fact that I'm the representative of civil society, I think the lone NGO here, but very pleased to be here. You've heard several references to our work together with the group that has provided this very timely, very useful report. Our engagement at the ICJ has been a parallel process. We have arrived, I'm glad to say, at broadly the same conclusions. It is our conclusion also that we really need a standing investigative mechanism, one that can support processes at the international, regional, and national levels, and quite important, one that can support OHCHR, the horrifically under-resourced third pillar, the unwanted orphan stepchild of the UN system, sometimes we think, with its 3% budget of the overall system. But we'll leave that aside. We'll come to it. So we have also arrived at this conclusion, and we are quite hopeful that having reached this conclusion and having engaged and continuing to engage on these issues with support from Germany, and the Netherlands, that we will be able now to move forward to the next step, which is to get states to agree to this, what we think is a very sensible and timely suggestion. We came at this from two different sides, again, reflecting the ICJ's role both as an NGO working on the ground with victims demanding justice, but also with commissioners who represent legal systems and human rights law from around the world. We arrived at this conclusion on the one hand from the work of our commissioners like Mazen Darwish, who himself is a right holder, who has demands for justice and who has largely been frustrated in the initial demands for justice. Our Commissioner Reed Brody, who has been more successful in terms of being able to achieve some accountability for what Hissène Habré did, other situations in Africa, or the work of my colleagues, Kingsley Abbott, who did quite a lot of work on Cambodia, but most recently working with the Rohingya, especially over the border in Bangladesh, trying to explain to them what all these different mechanisms were and trying to respond to their expectation of justice. What does this all mean? So that is one source of our arrival at this conclusion. It is clear that there is a political blockage. The ICJ was very involved in the establishment of the idea of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights years ago. It was created and we thought, yes, we did it, finally justice. Then the ICJ thought we would be really involved in the idea of the creation of a criminal court for international crimes. Yes, we did it, the ICC, justice. However, there are political realities, namely that 3 of the 5 members of the P5 that control access to the ICC have not ratified the Rome Statute, and some have threatened to bomb the ICC. This demand for justice is very, very real, and it cannot be ignored. And this is what is very different from what we're seeing in this process. And the second part of the second factor that drove us to this conclusion is what we have seen in the international environment. On the one hand, there is absolutely a clear sense of a breakdown in the international legal order that we have worked on. There is a sense of greater conflict, of greater impunity, and I think for many of us we can draw a clear line from what happened in Sri Lanka on the 18th of May, 12 years ago now, to Syria, to what the Russians did in Syria, to Ukraine. that there's a very clear line of the lessons that people learned from impunity, and therefore of the need for accountability for that to stop it. At the same time, despite this very depressing reality, for the ICJ, what is immensely positive is the demand for justice, the demand for human rights, the demand for accountability from people on the ground, from the victims, from rights holders, and in fact, increasingly from states. This is an astonishing thing. There's not just a demand for it, there's an expectation. Why is there not justice for all of these horrible things happening? Now, that is something that has moved incredibly quickly, I think, as Paul mentioned, and as Stephen himself mentioned, of course, given his experience, where we've moved from a situation where 30 years ago the idea of individual responsibility was unthinkable. What are you guys thinking? And 10 years ago, when we were setting up the Commission of Inquiry at the Human Rights Council on Sri Lanka, where it seemed unreal. And just a few years ago, where the idea of demanding sanctions for people who are complicit in human rights violations was laughed out. And now, of course, today, for a variety of reasons, all those things are happening. There is this incredible sense of momentum. There is a recognition that accountability matters. If you want to prevent atrocities, you have to punish the perpetrators. If you want to be serious about having an international legal order, you have to have a rule of law that addresses the commitments that states make very, very solemnly in rooms like this. And part of those commitments are that when human rights are violated, there will be justice. And of course, there's no doubt that for us, for the ICJ, justice is not just about individual criminal liability. It's about truth, it's about remediation, it's about guarantees of non-recurrence. But here we are, the idea of criminal liability, which at some point seemed really completely impossible to behold, has moved so far ahead that we now actually need coordinating bodies to coordinate all the different bodies that are demanding individual accountability. That's the kind of problem that we will take. We'll accept that. And looking at that problem, looking at where we are today, I think it is very clear, thanks to the great work that our colleagues at Oxford and the Holocaust Center did, that we need, and this is the moment to strengthen the global justice mechanism. We have the opportunity, and we have the opportunity to do it fairly easily. We're now talking about tweaking, essentially, the inevitable number of mandates that are being created here at the Human Rights Council, at the General Assembly, at the Security Council, to coordinate them, to rationalize them, to put them in a sense where they will be cheaper, more effective, quicker, and at the same time, make sure that they are there to promote and protect human rights. It's not just about criminal liability, that they're there to protect and promote all of the work that OHCHR is doing, that the commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions are doing, that the special rapporteurs and special procedures are doing. All of these, we believe, can be helped, as has been set out in the report, as we have shown, can be helped by coordinating and collecting and unifying the investigative mechanisms. The need for the German prosecutor to not have to speak and get to meet each new mechanism that is created. I think Nick brought that point, and that image really stuck with me. That's really important. So from the ground up, from the work of our commissioners, from our history of 70 years of setting norms, we've arrived here. And we're incredibly pleased that we're able to sit here, that we have this audience here. We're incredibly happy that Ambassador Meshach is here. That's an important signal to us. Our colleagues and friends will support us. And we look forward to the rest of this process, to working together with Germany and other interested states to move forward, to get state approval for this process, and therefore to be able to respond to the demand for justice. Ambassador Meshach responded to justice entrepreneurs and how they've been able to find justice wherever they can, through sanctions, through national or regional or international courts. The image that I always had, justice entrepreneurs frankly sounds a little too Republican for me. The image that I've always had is that there is a flood of outrage, and that this flood is unstoppable, and that this flood will find wherever it can to demand justice and to get accountability. And I think this is the moment for us to move this a little bit forward. And we're very, very pleased that our very smart colleagues at Oxford have come up with a document that, by and large, also supports the conclusions we have reached, and we hope that we can work together with all of you to make the conclusions real. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. There's a theory in communications that the person who speaks last is the person that people listen to. So with that in mind, I just want to thank you for your clear articulation that the demand for justice is real, and to also remind all of us of the urgency of this conversation right now. We at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum are aware every single day that 80 years after the Holocaust, victims and survivors still seek justice. They are still seeking criminal prosecutions of perpetrators, and that there are many communities today that are involved in the same endeavor and stand in solidarity then with the over 11 million Syrians who have been forced from their homes and those who remain inside unable to afford themselves of security, the over 1 million Rohingya that live in Bangladesh right now, and over 400,000 who remain in Rakhine in a similar state of vulnerability, the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who have fled the crimes of Daesh, and who, many of whom have been unable to return home or too scared to return home, and appreciate very much the work that all of you are doing to try to advance justice and accountability for them. I think, as you eloquently just said, this is the moment, and I very much appreciate the statements from Ambassador Yeager, Ambassador Stash, from Ambassador Van Schaack about how to seize this particular moment with the spotlight on Ukraine. I think there is the room for conversation that perhaps can be transformative as it pertains to these issues, and very much welcome the effort by Germany to raise this in the context of the G7. That's really remarkable, and to see accountability being discussed in that fora is truly unique, and for your country, given your history, as you said, to do so, we really commend the efforts that are being taken there. This is the first of many conversations and the aftermath of the launch of the report that will take place. And I just want to thank you all. I'd like to thank Ambassador Yeager, Ambassador Stash, Ambassador Van Schaack, and also recognize U.S. Ambassador Taylor, who just had to step out, for being here and for your support of this endeavor, and really congratulate the authors, Ambassador Rapp, Frederica, Kirsty, and Sarita, for your remarkable work. Thank you all for attending.